The medieval world stood at a turning point. At the heart of Christendom, Pope Urban II prepared to deliver one of the most momentous speeches in history. The message would spark a movement that would send tens of thousands of knights, nobles, and peasants marching eastward toward a land they had never seen. It would be called the First Crusade. But to understand why this movement began, we must first explore the state of the world in the 11th century, the rivalries, the ambitions, and the growing divide between East and West that set the stage for one of the most defining wars of the Middle Ages. The fragmented Christian world marked a time of great division in the Christian world. The two major branches of Christianity, the Latin Church of the West and the Greek Church of the East, had drifted further apart over centuries of cultural and political differences. The Great Schism of 1054. In 1054, a formal split had occurred between Rome and Constantinople in what became known as the Great Schism. The Pope in Rome and the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople no longer shared full communion. Disputes over the authority of the Pope, theological differences, and political conflicts had widened the rift. Though divided, both Christian worlds faced a common threat: the rapid expansion of Islamic powers in the east, the rise of the Seljuk Turks. To the east, the once powerful Byzantine Empire had been steadily losing ground. A new enemy had arrived in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, the Seljuk Turks, a powerful Turkic dynasty that had expanded into Persia, the Levant, and Asia Minor. The Battle of Manzikert. One event in particular had shaken the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine army under Emperor Romanos IV faced the Seljuk Turks at Manzikert, in what is now eastern Turkey. The Byzantines suffered a crushing defeat. The Seljuks overran most of Anatolia, the heartland of the Byzantine Empire. By the 1090s, Constantinople itself was under threat, and the Byzantines were losing control of their empire. Desperate for aid, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos turned to the west, reaching out to the Pope for help. The Byzantine appeal for help. In March 1095, representatives from Byzantine Emperor Alexios I arrived at the Council of Piacenza, a meeting of church officials in northern Italy. They brought a message from the emperor, an appeal to the Pope and the Christian rulers of the West for military assistance. The Seljuk Turks had captured major Byzantine cities, cut off pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem and the Holy Land, threatened the very survival of Eastern Christendom. The emperor requested Western knights and mercenaries to help push back the Seljuks and reclaim lost territory. What he likely expected was a limited force of trained warriors. What he got, however, was something far greater than he could have imagined. Pope Urban II's vision. The birth of the Crusades. After the Council of Piacenza, Pope Urban II began planning a response. But Urban's ambitions went beyond merely helping the Byzantine. He saw an opportunity, a way to unify Christendom, reassert papal authority, and expand the influence of the Church. The papacy's weakened position. For decades, the Catholic Church had been embroiled in a power struggle with European monarchs, particularly the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. This was known as the investiture controversy, a dispute over who held the right to appoint bishops, the Pope or the secular rulers. By calling for a holy war, Urban could rally the Christian nobility under the banner of the Church, strengthen the Pope's authority over kings and emperors, direct Christian military aggression outward rather than inward. This idea had been developing for years, but now, with the Byzantines requesting aid, the moment had arrived. The Council of Clermont. The call to crusade. In November 1095, Pope Urban II gathered church officials, noblemen, and clergy in the city of Clermont, France. On November 27, he delivered a sermon that would change the course of history. The speech survives in several different versions, but its core message remains the same. Urban called upon the knights and nobles of Europe to take up arms in the name of Christ, march east to defend their fellow Christians, recapture Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Urban painted a vivid picture of Christian suffering under Muslim rule, describing churches desecrated, pilgrims attacked and humiliated, the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the most sacred site in Christendom, defiled. Then he made a promise, one that would drive thousands to take the cross. Whoever shall set out on this journey and die on the way, whether by land or by sea, shall have immediate remission of their sins. This meant that anyone who fought in the crusade would have their sins forgiven, a direct path to salvation. The crowd erupted with cries of Deus Vult, God wills it. The crusade had begun. The response: a movement spreads across Europe. The Pope's call spread like wildfire throughout Europe. His message resonated with many different groups for different reasons. Knights and nobles saw an opportunity for glory, honor, and land. Ordinary peasants and townspeople saw a chance for salvation and redemption. Merchants and traders saw economic opportunities in the East. Over the next months, thousands of men took the cross, marking themselves as crusaders by sewing a red cross onto their clothing. From France, Germany, Italy, and beyond, armies began to form, but not all who took up the call were trained warriors. Some, driven by religious zeal and desperation, set out immediately, without waiting for leadership or proper supplies. This led to chaos and disaster. The People's Crusade, a disaster in the making. Before the official Crusader armies could assemble, a mass movement of peasants, farmers and minor knights set out toward the Holy Land. This would become known as the People's Crusade, led by a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit. Peter inspired tens of thousands of poor and untrained followers, promising that God would protect them. They lacked military discipline. They had little food or supplies. They resorted to looting and attacking local communities to survive. As they marched east, violence erupted, particularly against Jewish communities in Germany, as mobs slaughtered Jewish populations in what became one of the first anti-Semitic massacres of the Middle Ages. Eventually this undisciplined horde reached Byzantium, where Emperor Alexios I saw them as a liability rather than an asset. He quickly ferried them across the Bosporus, into Turkish-controlled lands, where they were massacred by the Seljuk Turks. The People's Crusade had failed, but behind them the true Crusader armies were on their way. The Crusaders assemble, the march to Constantinople. The autumn of 1096 marked the true beginning of the First Crusade. Unlike the disastrous People's Crusade, this time Europe's most powerful knights and lords were assembling their armies, ready for a long and perilous journey to the Holy Land. But before they could even reach Jerusalem, they would have to march through thousands of miles of hostile territory, facing the elements, starvation and betrayal. Their first destination was Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had called for aid, but he would soon realize that the Crusaders he had summoned were not allies, but a potential threat to his empire. This was the march to Constantinople, the first great test of the Crusaders' strength and unity. The Crusader leaders and their armies. Unlike the ragtag People's Crusade, the official Crusader forces were led by experienced military commanders, each bringing their own ambitions and rivalries. The four main Crusader contingents came from different regions of Europe, each commanded by a powerful noble, one Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, a pious warrior from modern-day Belgium and Germany. He had served the Holy Roman Emperor Henry I, but now turned his allegiance to the Pope. His army well-trained knights from Germany and northern France. 2. Bohemond of Taranto, Norman prince of southern Italy, a towering battle-hardened warrior with a reputation as a brilliant strategist. He had spent years fighting the Byzantines, and Emperor Alexios did not trust him. His army elite Norman knights, known for their military discipline. 3. Raymond IV of Toulouse, Count of Toulouse, southern France. The wealthiest and oldest of the Crusader leaders, known for his deep piety. He brought with him Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the Pope's official representative on the crusade. His army well financed, but plagued by internal disputes. 4. Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois, northern France and England. Robert of Normandy was the eldest son of William the Conqueror. Stephen of Blois, his brother-in-law, was wealthy but lacked the courage of the other leaders. Their army, a powerful force of Norman and Frankish knights. Each of these leaders had their own ambitions, and as they marched toward Constantinople, tensions between them would begin to shape the future of the crusade. The route to Constantinople, a treacherous journey. The Crusaders did not march as one unified army. Instead, they traveled in separate contingents, each taking different routes toward the Byzantine capital. By late 1096, the first of these forces set out. Hugh of Vermandois, the first arrival. Hugh, the younger brother of the King of France, led one of the smaller Crusader forces. He sailed across the Adriatic Sea but was shipwrecked off the Byzantine coast. Byzantine forces rescued him and escorted him to Constantinople, where Emperor Alexios forced him to swear an oath of loyalty before allowing him to continue. Godfrey of Bouillon's march through Hungary. Godfrey led his forces overland through the Holy Roman Empire and into Hungary. The Hungarians, wary of the People's Crusade, demanded hostages to ensure the Crusaders behaved. After weeks of cautious marching, Godfrey reached Constantinople in December 10. Bohemond of Taranto's route through the Balkans. Bohemond, the most feared of the Crusader leaders, took a direct route through the Balkans. He avoided looting Byzantine lands, hoping to win the emperor's trust, but Alexios was suspicious of his true motives. Bohemond arrived at Constantinople in April 10. Raymond of Toulouse's difficult journey. Raymond's army suffered severe hardships crossing the Balkans. Disease and hunger ravaged his troops, but he remained committed to reaching the Holy Land. He was the last of the major Crusader leaders to reach Constantinople in May. By the spring of 1097, the full force of the First Crusade had gathered outside the walls of Constantinople. Tensions with the Byzantine Emperor. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had requested aid from the Pope, but he had not expected such a large and independent-minded army. The Byzantines had hoped for a few hundred elite knights to serve as mercenaries. Instead, they were confronted by tens of thousands of heavily armed crusaders, eager for war. Alexios distrusted the Crusaders, especially Bohemond, whose Normans had invaded Byzantine lands in the past. To control the situation, Alexios demanded an oath from the Crusader leaders. They would swear allegiance to him. They would return any captured lands that had once belonged to Byzantium. Most Crusader leaders reluctantly agreed, seeing the emperor as their only source of supplies and transport across the Bosporus. But tensions flared between Alexios and Raymond of Toulouse, who refused to take the oath, believing the crusade was a mission for God, not the Byzantine. Despite the growing mistrust, Alexios provided the Crusaders with guides and supplies before ferrying them across the Bosporus into Asia Minor. The first battle, the Siege of Nicaea, May-June 1097, with the Crusader army now in Asia Minor. Their first objective was Nicaea, a fortified city held by the Seljuk Turks. Nicaea was strategically important because it blocked the Crusaders' path deeper into Turkish-held territory. The siege begins. The Crusaders surrounded 3 of Nicaea's gates, but its strong walls prevented them from quickly breaking through. Meanwhile, the Seljuk Sultan Kilizur Arslan was caught off guard. He had underestimated the Crusaders, and was away fighting another war. Turkish counterattack. When Kilizur Arslan returned, he launched a fierce attack on the Crusader forces. The battle raged for hours, but the Crusaders held their ground, forcing the Turks to retreat into the city. The Byzantine betrayal. As the Crusaders prepared to storm the walls, Emperor Alexios secretly negotiated with the Turkish garrison. On June 18, 1097, the Byzantines took control of the city without the Crusaders. The Crusaders were furious. They had expected to plunder Nicaea, but instead the Byzantines shut them out. Despite the tensions, the Crusaders had won their first major victory. But this was only the beginning. Ahead of them lay the vast plains and mountains of Anatolia, where the Seljuks would make their stand. The Battle of Dar-el-Ayyum. The Crusaders faced the Seljuks. With the fall of Nicaea, the Crusaders had achieved their first victory. But their journey had only just begun. They now had to march deep into Asia Minor, a land controlled by the Seljuk Turks. This journey would test their endurance, discipline, and unity, for the road ahead was filled with danger. The Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan I had underestimated them once before. Now he was determined not to make the same mistake again. As the Crusaders advanced, they would soon find themselves surrounded and outnumbered, facing the full force of the Turkish army. This was the Battle of Dar el-Yum, the first major clash between the Crusaders and the Seljuks. The march across Anatolia. After the siege of Nicaea, the Crusader leaders gathered to decide their next move. The goal was to reach the city of Antioch, a major stronghold on the road to Jerusalem. But to get there they had to march over 500 miles across the scorching Anatolian plateau, where food and water were scarce. To avoid supply shortages, the Crusaders split into two separate forces: the vanguard, led by Bohemond of Taranto, accompanied by Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, and Hugh of Vermont; the main army, following a day behind, commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy. This was a risky strategy, but it allowed them to cover more ground and reduce the strain on their limited resources. However, it also left them dangerously exposed to a Turkish ambush. The Turkish ambush, July 1, 1097. As Bohemond's army moved forward, they passed through the ruins of Dar el-Yum, a former Byzantine city. Unbeknownst to them, Kilij Arslan had assembled a massive force of Turkish cavalry, watching their every move. At dawn on July 1, the Seljuk Turks launched a surprise attack, striking with deadly precision. The Seljuk tactics: the Turks fought as mounted archers, riding in fast-moving formation. They would rush in, fire a volley of arrows, then retreat before the Crusaders could engage them in close combat. The Crusaders, weighed down by heavy armor, struggled to catch the swift Turkish horsemen. The Crusaders' desperate stand. The Normans and Flemish knights tried to form defensive lines, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Turkish arrows rained down on them, cutting through their ranks. Women, children and camp followers were slaughtered. As panic began to spread, Bohemond and Robert of Normandy ordered their knights to dismount and form a tight shield wall, forcing the Turks to engage them in hand-to-hand combat. The battle raged for hours, with the Crusaders holding their ground, but suffering heavy casualties. Their only hope was for reinforcements to arrive, but the main army was still miles away. The turning point: the arrival of Godfrey and Raymond. Back at the main camp, Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse had received word that the vanguard was under attack. Without hesitation, they ordered their entire army to march at full speed to the battlefield. As the sun reached its peak, the Crusaders in the vanguard were nearly exhausted. Just as defeat seemed inevitable, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Godfrey and Raymond had arrived. The counter-attack: Godfrey led a cavalry charge straight into the side of the Turkish forces. Raymond's knights struck from the opposite flank, trapping the Turks between two Crusader armies. The Seljuks, now surrounded, began to panic. Seeing their forces collapse, Kilij Arslan ordered a full retreat, abandoning the battlefield. Aftermath: a hard-earned victory. The Battle of Dar el-Yum was the first true test of the Crusader army, and they had survived. The victory proved that, when united, the Crusaders could withstand even the fiercest attacks from the Turks. However, the battle also came at a cost. Thousands of Crusaders had been killed or wounded. The journey ahead would be even more difficult, with no certainty of food or water. But one thing was clear: the road to Jerusalem was still open. The Crusaders had defied the odds, and their march would continue. The march to Antioch, a city of blood and betrayal. With their victory at Dar el-Yum, the Crusaders had proven their strength. But their greatest challenges still lay ahead. To reach Jerusalem, they had to cross the vast and unforgiving landscape of Anatolia, where the land was hostile, barren, and scorched by the summer sun. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion would claim more lives than the enemy's sword. But even as they endured endless suffering, they pushed forward, driven by their faith, their oaths, and their unbreakable resolve. At the end of their suffering awaited Antioch, one of the greatest cities in the East. But Antioch was not just a fortress, it was a prison of betrayal, hunger, and slaughter. It was here that the Crusaders would face their greatest test of survival. The march through Anatolia, a journey of suffering. After the Battle of Dar el-Yum, the Crusaders resumed their march eastward, deeper into the Seljuk-controlled lands of Asia Minor. But this was no ordinary march, it was a march of misery. The harsh realities of the journey. The scorching summer heat drained their strength, food was scarce, they had to eat roots, leaves and whatever they could find. Water was even scarcer, thousands died of dehydration. Those too weak to continue were left behind to die. The once mighty army that had stormed across Anatolia was now reduced to starving, skeletal figures, and Kilizar Arslan, despite his defeat at Derelium, was not finished with them yet. Turkish raids and the fight for survival. As the Crusaders dragged themselves forward, Turkish raiding parties stalked them from the hills and mountains. They attacked isolated groups, slaughtering those who fell behind. They poisoned water wells, ensuring the Crusaders would remain thirsty and desperate. They set fire to the land, so nothing could be gathered or eaten. The Seljuks never confronted them in open battle. Instead, they waged a war of attrition, slowly bleeding the Crusaders to the edge of collapse. The Armenian connection, a ray of hope, but then a miracle came from an unexpected source. The Crusaders encountered Armenian Christian communities who welcomed them as liberators. The Armenians provided shelter for the sick and dying, food and water to keep them moving, guides to lead them through treacherous mountain passes. It was in these lands that Baldwin of Buyan, brother of Godfrey of Buyan, saw an opportunity. Hearing of rich Christian cities in Mesopotamia, Baldwin broke away from the main army and set his sights on Edessa, where an Armenian prince ruled over a prosperous city. Baldwin's decision to leave the crusade would change the fate of the East forever. Baldwin and the birth of the First Crusader state. Edessa was one of the most powerful cities in the region, but it was vulnerable. Its Armenian ruler, Thoros, was desperate for a strong ally against the surrounding Muslim state. Baldwin saw his chance, and convinced Thoros to adopt him as his son and heir. But soon after, a mysterious revolt erupted in the city. Thoros was murdered, and Baldwin took control of Edessa, becoming the first Crusader lord in the East. The county of Edessa, the first of the Crusader states, was born. But as Baldwin seized power, the main Crusader army had finally arrived at their greatest challenge yet, the siege of Antioch, the city of death. After months of starvation, exhaustion, and relentless Turkish attacks, the Crusaders stood before the mighty walls of Antioch. Antioch was no ordinary city, it was a fortress, with massive stone walls stretching for miles, over 400 towers, each heavily defended, a garrison of Turkish warriors, ready to fight to the death. Taking Antioch by force seemed impossible, but the Crusaders had no choice. They could not continue to Jerusalem until Antioch had fallen. And so, the longest and bloodiest siege of the First Crusade began. The first attack, a failed assault. The Crusaders, desperate for a quick victory, launched a full-scale assault on Antioch's walls, but the Turkish defenders rained arrows, stones and fire down upon them. Every attack was repelled, and the Crusaders were forced to retreat. With no way to breach the city, they realized they would have to starve the defenders out. But what they didn't know was that they would be the ones to starve first. A winter of starvation and betrayal. As the siege dragged on, winter arrived, and with it came disease, hunger and despair. Food supplies ran out, men boiled leather and ate rats to survive. Thousands deserted, including high-ranking knights. The Byzantine allies abandoned them, leaving the Crusaders to fight alone. Even Peter the Hermit, the famous preacher who had inspired the crusade, tried to flee in the night, but as the Crusaders sank into misery, a traitor within the city walls would soon deliver them their salvation. The betrayal. The gates of Antioch open. Bohemond of Taranto, the cunning Norman general, knew that Antioch's walls were too strong to break, but he also knew that men could be bribed. Bohemond secretly contacted Firuz, a disgruntled Turkish commander inside the city, and made him an offer. "If you open the gates for us, I will make you rich beyond your dreams." Firuz agreed. Under cover of darkness, Bohemond led a small elite force to the towers controlled by Firuz. True to his word, Firuz betrayed the city, unlocking the gates. The Crusaders poured into Antioch, slaughtering its defenders and seizing control. The city had fallen, but just as victory seemed within their grasp, disaster struck. Kerbogah's army arrives. The Crusaders become the besieged. No sooner had the Crusaders taken Antioch, than word arrived that a massive Muslim army was approaching. Kerbogah,
The powerful Atabeg of Mosul was leading a force of over 40,000 soldiers, the largest army the Crusaders had ever faced. In a cruel twist of fate, the Crusaders who had been the besiegers were now the ones trapped inside the city. Weakened by months of starvation, they had no food, no reinforcements, and no way to escape. It seemed like their doom was sealed. But then, a miracle was discovered, a relic that would turn the tide of battle and inspire the Crusaders to their greatest victory yet.
The Holy Lance and the miracle at Antioch. The Crusaders had endured months of starvation, betrayal, and brutal combat to take Antioch. But just as they seized control, they faced an even greater disaster. A massive Muslim army led by Kerbogha, the Atabeg of Mosul, had arrived at the city's gates. The Crusaders, once the besiegers, were now the besieged. With no food, no reinforcements, and nowhere to run, they prepared for one final battle. A battle that would determine the fate of the First Crusade. The arrival of Kerbogha, the News Titans. Kerbogha was one of the most powerful warlords in the Islamic world. He had spent months assembling an army of Turks, Persians, Arabs, and Kurds, all united under his command. His 40,000-strong force was twice the size of the Crusader army. He had war elephants, siege engines, and elite archers trained in steppe warfare. His army was well-fed, well-rested, and confident of victory. When Kerbogha reached Antioch, he surrounded the city, cutting off any hope of escape. For the Crusaders inside, this was the end. Starvation and despair. The breaking point. The situation inside Antioch was catastrophic. The food supplies were gone, men ate rats, weeds, and even the leather from their shoes. Disease spread rapidly, claiming thousands of lives. Desertions increased, entire groups of Crusaders abandoned their posts and tried to flee. Some knights openly talked about surrender, believing God had abandoned them. Even Bohemond and Godfrey, the Crusaders' greatest warriors, saw no path to victory. But then, as all hope seemed lost, a miracle was discovered. The Holy Lance, a sign from God. One day, a poor priest, named Peter Bartholomew, approached Count Raymond of Toulouse. Peter claimed he had received a vision from Andrew, who revealed that the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side on the cross, was buried beneath Antioch's cathedral. The Crusaders, desperate for a sign from heaven, immediately began digging. At first, nothing was found. Doubt began to spread. But then, after hours of digging, Peter Bartholomew cried out. He had found a rusted iron spearhead buried deep in the ground. The Crusaders erupted in joy. They believed this was God's sign that they were destined to win the battle. Their faith was restored, and morale soared. Even those who doubted the authenticity of the lance realized that the army needed hope, and so, the Holy Lance was carried into battle. Bohemond's plan. A final gamble. With starvation worsening in Kerbogha, preparing for a final assault, Bohemond and Godfrey made a bold decision. Instead of waiting to be slaughtered, they would attack first. It was a suicidal gamble, but it was their only chance. The Crusader army, though outnumbered, was hardened by months of battle. Bohemond devised a brilliant battle plan, split the army into 6 divisions to form an organized attack, march out of the city gate in full formation, using the Holy Lance to rally the troops, target Kerbogha's weaker allies first. If they broke ranks, his army would collapse. If this failed, the Crusaders would be annihilated. But if they succeeded, they could turn the tide of history. The Battle of Antioch. A shocking victory. On the morning of June 28, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch. Kerbogha, confident of an easy victory, was unprepared for a full-scale charge. The first wave struck his weaker Syrian and Kurdish allies, who immediately fled the battlefield. The second wave broke through his center, forcing the Turks into chaos. The Holy Lance, held high in the air, inspired the starving Crusaders to fight harder than ever before. Seeing his allies retreat, Kerbogha panicked. In less than an hour, his massive army had collapsed. The Crusaders had won. Kerbogha and his remaining forces fled the battlefield, abandoning their supplies, weapons, and food. For the Crusaders, this was a miracle. They had defeated the largest Muslim army of the Crusade and secured Antioch. Aftermath. The fall of Antioch and Bohemond's rise to power. The victory at Antioch was one of the most shocking upsets in medieval history. The Crusaders, despite being weakened and starving, had defeated a superior army. The Holy Lance became a symbol of divine intervention, strengthening their belief that God was guiding their mission. The victory secured Antioch as a new Crusader stronghold, but political tensions soon erupted. Bohemond of Taranto, who had led the battle, claimed Antioch as his own. Count Raymond of Toulouse disagreed, arguing that the city should be given back to the Byzantines. The Crusader leaders bitterly argued for months, delaying the advance toward Jerusalem. But in the end, Bohemond emerged victorious. He refused to hand over Antioch, establishing the Principality of Antioch, the Second Crusader state. The road to Jerusalem. The final chapter begins, with Antioch secure. The Crusaders turned their attention south. Jerusalem, their ultimate goal, was still hundreds of miles away, and ruled by a powerful Egyptian army. But after everything they had endured, the starvation, the betrayals and the impossible battles, they were closer than ever. Their holy war was not yet over, but soon they would stand before the gates of Jerusalem, the city they had sacrificed everything to reclaim, and the final bloody battle was about to begin. The siege of Jerusalem, the final battle for the Holy Land. The Crusaders march south through enemy territory. They arrive at Jerusalem, only to face massive walls and an Egyptian army. A final legendary battle will decide the fate of the Holy City. The siege of Jerusalem, the final battle for the Holy Land. After nearly 4 years of war, starvation and hardship, the Crusaders had one final goal: Jerusalem. But their greatest challenge still lay ahead. The Fatimid rulers of Egypt controlled the city and had reinforced its walls. Inside, a well-prepared garrison awaited their arrival, determined to defend the Holy City. The Crusaders, weakened by their long journey, now faced their greatest test, a siege against impossible odds. The final battle for Jerusalem had begun. The road to Jerusalem, entering Fatimid territory, crossing into Palestine with Antioch secured. The Crusader army, now numbering around 14,000 men, marched south toward Jerusalem. In January, they faced one final obstacle. The city was controlled by the Fatimid Caliphate, the powerful Shia rulers of Egypt. The Fatimids had already sent peace envoys to the Crusaders, offering them a deal: they could control Syria if they left Jerusalem alone. The Crusaders refused. Their mission was not to conquer land, it was to take Jerusalem. With no negotiations possible, the Fatimids prepared for war. Crusaders moved through coastal cities. The Crusaders moved slowly through Lebanon and Palestine, avoiding large battle. Many Muslim rulers in the region surrendered peacefully, preferring to pay tribute rather than fight. Cities like Acre, Beirut and Sidon paid the Crusaders to leave them alone. Others, like Tripoli, offered provisions, food and gold in exchange for a temporary alliance. By June 6, the Crusaders finally reached the outskirts of Jerusalem. At the top of Mount Joy, they saw the Holy City for the first time. For many, this was the most emotional moment of the entire crusade. They fell to their knees weeping, praying and kissing the ground. But their journey was not over. Jerusalem still had to be taken by force. Jerusalem's defenses, a formidable challenge. The Fatimids had fortified the city, knowing an attack was coming. High stone walls nearly 50 feet tall surrounded Jerusalem. Watchtowers and gatehouses reinforced every entrance. A garrison of 1,000 elite soldiers, led by the governor Iftikhar ad-Dawla, was ready for battle. The Fatimids had expelled all Christian civilians, fearing they would aid the Crusader. Most dangerously, the city's wells and cisterns had been poisoned. The Crusaders, exhausted and starving, had no water sources nearby. If they could not take the city quickly, they would die of thirst. A direct assault was the only option. The first assault, June 13, the Crusaders launched their first attack just a week after arriving. They charged the walls using ladders and siege towers. The Fatimid defenders fought fiercely, raining arrows, boiling oil and stones down upon them. Every attempt to climb the walls failed. After hours of brutal fighting, the Crusaders were forced to retreat. It was clear they needed better siege equipment. The arrival of the Genoese fleet, a turning point. Just when the Crusaders' hope began to fade, a miracle arrived from the sea. A Genoese fleet landed at Jaffa, bringing timber, supplies and siege engineers. With this crucial material, the Crusaders built massive siege towers and battering rams. Now they had the tools needed to break into the city. The final assault was set for July. This would be their last chance to take Jerusalem. The final assault, July 14-15. Giant siege towers rolled toward the city gates, carrying archers and knights. The fighting was brutal. The Fatimids set fire to many of the siege towers. The Crusaders fought hand to hand, climbing over the dead to reach the wall. Godfrey moved his tower during the night, placing it at the weakest section of the wall. On July 15 at midday, Godfrey's men breached the walls. The Crusaders poured into the city, slaughtering the defender. The fall of Jerusalem. The final battle. Once inside the walls, the Crusaders overwhelmed the Fatimids. The gates were opened, allowing thousands of troops to rush in. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was captured, and the Fatimid governors surrendered the Tower of David. Many residents fled to the Temple Mount, hoping for mercy. The fighting lasted until evening. By nightfall, Jerusalem was in Crusader hands. The aftermath. The massacre of Jerusalem. The battle was over, but the violence continued. The Crusaders, believing they were on a mission from God, showed no mercy. Thousands of Muslim and Jewish residents were killed in the chaos. Many sought refuge in the city's synagogues and mosques, but even those places were not spared. Some defenders were allowed to surrender in exchange for gold, but most were executed. The massacre was brutal, but it followed the accepted rules of medieval warfare in those days. A city that resisted siege was not granted mercy. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is born on July 22. The Crusaders gathered at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to elect a new ruler. They offered the crown to Raymond of Toulouse, but he refused, saying only Christ should wear a crown in Jerusalem. Instead, Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen as defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He ruled not as a king but as a protector of the newly created Kingdom of Jerusalem. But the Crusaders could not rest yet. A Fatimid army was marching from Egypt, seeking to retake Jerusalem. The final battle of the crusade was still ahead, the Battle of Ascalon. The final victory. The Fatimids sent a massive army, nearly 20,000 soldiers, led by Vizier al-Afdal. The Crusaders rushed south to confront them at Ascalon. On August 12, Godfrey and Raymond led a surprise attack at dawn. The Fatimid army, expecting to attack first, was caught off guard. The Crusaders charged in full force, overwhelming the Egyptian forces. In just a few hours, the Fatimid army was crushed. With this final victory, the First Crusade officially ended. The legacy of the First Crusade. The Crusaders had achieved the impossible. They had captured Jerusalem, defeating some of the most powerful armies in the Islamic world. But their victory would not last forever. The Crusader states would be surrounded by enemies, constantly fighting for survival. More crusades would follow, some victorious, others disastrous, and within a century Jerusalem would fall again, leading to more wars. But for now, the First Crusaders had changed history. They had carved out a new Christian kingdom in the heart of the Muslim world, and the age of the Crusades had begun. The aftermath of the First Crusade and the birth of the Crusader states. With Jerusalem secured, the Crusaders had achieved their ultimate goal, but victory did not mean peace. The Holy Land was surrounded by powerful Muslim states, all eager to retake Jerusalem. To survive, the Crusaders needed to establish permanent rule, fortify their cities, and prepare for inevitable retaliation. From the ashes of war, a new political order emerged. The Crusaders. This would mark the beginning of a new era of warfare, diplomacy, and religious conflict in the Middle East. The First Crusader kingdoms. In the wake of their victories, the Crusaders established four major states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, ruled by Godfrey of Bouillon, later by his brother Baldwin I; the Principality of Antioch, controlled by the powerful Norman general Bohemond of Turin; the County of Edessa, established by Baldwin of Bouillon, providing a key stronghold in the north; the County of Tripoli, created by Raymond I of Toulouse, securing the coastal region. These Christian states would shape the political and military landscape of the Middle East for nearly 200 years. The struggle for power. Who would rule Jerusalem? After the capture of Jerusalem, a major conflict broke out among the Crusader leaders. Godfrey of Bouillon, the first ruler. Godfrey refused to take the title of King of Jerusalem, believing only Christ should be king. Instead, he ruled as defender of the Holy Sepulchre,
balancing secular and religious power. He quickly secured alliances with the Christian cities of Jaffa and Haifa, strengthening his control. But in July 1100, just a year after taking power, Godfrey died suddenly, likely of disease. This left Jerusalem without a clear ruler, sparking a new power struggle. Baldwin I, the first king of Jerusalem. With Godfrey dead, the Crusader leaders turned to his brother, Baldwin of Bouillon, who had founded the county of Edessa. Baldwin marched south to Jerusalem, fighting off rival factions. On Christmas Day, 1100, he crowned himself king of Jerusalem, becoming the first official ruler. Unlike Godfrey, Baldwin embraced full kingship, organizing a permanent monarchy. Baldwin spent the next 18 years fortifying Jerusalem, expanding its borders and turning it into a true kingdom. The fall of Bohemond, the Norman prince's defeat. While Baldwin secured Jerusalem, Bohemond of Taranto faced his own battles in Antioch. In 1100, Bohemond led a campaign against the Danish men-Turks in Anatolia. He was ambushed, captured and imprisoned for 3 years. His nephew Tancred took control of Antioch in his absence, but the principality remained unstable. Upon his release in 1103, Bohemond tried to rebuild his power, but he never regained full control. By 1111 he had returned to Europe, leaving his territories behind. This marked the beginning of internal divisions among the Crusader states, weakening their ability to defend against Muslim counterattacks. Muslim resistance. The first jihad against the Crusaders. The Muslim world had been divided when the Crusaders arrived, allowing for their initial success. But by the early 1100s, Muslim leaders began to unite against the Crusader states. The rise of the Seljuk Turks. In 1104, the Seljuks launched a major offensive, defeating Baldwin's forces at the Battle of Harran. Antioch and Edessa were weakened, making them vulnerable to further attacks. This was the first major Muslim victory against the Crusaders, showing that the Christian states were not invincible. The Fatimid counterattack. The Egyptian Fatimids launched several invasions to retake Jerusalem. Baldwin I personally led armies to defeat them at Ramla, 1105, and Jaffa, but the Fatimids continued to threaten Jerusalem, forcing the Crusaders to stay on constant alert. By 1110, it was clear the Crusader states would not survive without constant military defense. The creation of the Knights Templar and other orders. To protect the Holy Land, the Crusaders needed more soldiers, but with few reinforcements coming from Europe, they turned to a new solution: military orders. The Knights Templar, warrior monks. Founded in 1119, the Knights Templar combined religion and warfare. They took monastic vows but trained as elite knights. Their mission: protect Christian pilgrims and fight against Muslim forces. The Templars soon became legendary, playing a key role in defending the Crusader states. Other groups followed, including the Hospitallers, who provided medical aid and military support. The Teutonic Knights, who later expanded their influence to Eastern Europe. These warrior monks became the backbone of Christian military power in the Holy Land. The rise of new crusades. Despite the Crusaders' victories, their grip on the Holy Land was fragile. Muslim forces were regrouping. The Crusader states were small and outnumbered. Without reinforcements, they could easily fall. To secure their position, the popes in Rome called for more crusades. These would come in the form of the Second Crusade, a failed attempt to reinforce the Crusaders. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, after Jerusalem fell to Saladin. The Fourth Crusade, 1202-1204, a disaster that ended with the sacking of Constantinople, rather than fighting the Muslims. The First Crusade had succeeded, but the battles were far from over. The legacy of the First Crusade. The First Crusade had changed history forever. It created the Crusader states, bringing Christian rule to the Middle East for nearly 200 years. It ignited centuries of conflict between Christian and Muslim forces. It led to the rise of new military orders, shaping the future of warfare and religion. But the Crusader states were fragile. Without constant reinforcements, they would struggle to survive. Muslim forces were growing stronger and more united. A new generation of wars was just beginning.